It was already dark in Ouagadougou when televisions across the country suddenly became impossible to ignore. Families paused their evening routines. Radios were turned up. In quiet neighborhoods and crowded homes alike, a single message cut through the night: Burkina Faso was under threat again. Not from the desert, not from insurgents hiding in the bush, but from something far more dangerous, a plot from within the region itself. On national television, the government of Burkina Faso announced that its intelligence services had uncovered an alleged plan to assassinate President Ibrahim Traoré and violently overthrow the state. According to officials, this was not a rumor whispered on social media. It was a coordinated operation. And most alarming of all, they claimed the money behind it came from Ivory Coast, a neighboring nation, a regional rival, and a country millions had just watched defeat Burkina Faso on the football field days earlier. Suddenly, a football rivalry at AFCON felt insignificant. What was unfolding now was far more serious. For 3 years, Ibrahim Traoré has walked a narrow path. He cut ties with former Western allies. He pulled his country out of ECOWAS. He aligned Burkina Faso with Mali and Niger in a new Sahel alliance. To many across Africa, he became a symbol of resistance against foreign influence. To others, he became a problem that refused to stay quiet. And now, once again, the word coup has returned to the heart of West Africa. This was not the first attempt, not the second, but another moment where Burkina Faso found itself balancing on a knife's edge between sovereignty and chaos, between independence and isolation. So tonight we have to ask the uncomfortable questions. Is President Ibrahim Traoré truly the target of a foreign-backed destabilization plan? Or is this the inevitable backlash faced by any African leader who dares to choose a different path? And for us watching from the United States, what happens when Africa stops following the rules written elsewhere? If you believe stories like this deserve more attention than the headlines allow, please share this video and subscribe if you believe that truth, not comfort, should guide how we understand Africa, Burkina Faso, and the future now taking shape before our eyes. The warning did not come through rumors or anonymous leaks. It came directly from the state. Late at night, Burkina Faso's national television interrupted regular programming to broadcast a sober, tightly worded address from the country's Minister of National Security, Mamadou Sana. His tone was not theatrical. There was no raised voice, no dramatic pause meant to entertain. Instead, his words carried the weight of something far more serious, a country speaking because it believed silence was no longer an option. According to the Minister, intelligence services in Burkina Faso had uncovered what he described as a coordinated plot to overthrow the government and assassinate President Ibrahim Traoré. This was not framed as a vague threat or a hypothetical risk. It was presented as an operation already in motion, planned, financed, and moving toward execution. The alleged objectives were chillingly specific. The plot, authorities said, aimed first at the physical elimination of President Traoré, followed by attacks on key state institutions designed to paralyze the government and create chaos in the capital. The intention, according to the broadcast, was not merely to remove a leader, but to collapse the structure of the state itself, opening the door to a forced change of power. To support these claims, the minister referenced intelligence findings and a leaked video that investigators say helped expose the network behind the plan. While the contents of that video were not fully aired, its existence was presented as a critical piece of evidence, one that convinced authorities the threat was real, imminent, and organized. Several individuals, the minister confirmed, had already been arrested in connection with the plot. Their identities were not disclosed on air, but the implication was clear. The investigation had moved beyond theory and into enforcement. Then came the most explosive allegation of the night. According to Burkina Faso's security services, the plot was hatched and financed from outside the country, specifically from Ivory Coast. Officials claimed that the planning, coordination, and funding all traced back across the border, transforming what might have been framed as an internal power struggle into a regional crisis. This accusation immediately raised the stakes. Ivory Coast is not just any neighbor. It is one of Burkina Faso's most significant regional rivals, with a long, complicated history shaped by migration, economic ties, political tensions, and past allegations of cross-border interference. To accuse it directly and publicly of financing an assassination attempt against a sitting head of state was an extraordinary move. Even more striking was the claim that the operation involved a former transitional president living in exile. While no name was officially stated in the broadcast, the suggestion added another layer of gravity. This was not just a rogue group or a handful of disgruntled officers, but potentially a political counter-project led by figures with experienced networks and ambition. As the address ended, one thing became unmistakably clear: Burkina Faso wanted the world to know that this was not business as usual. For President Ibrahim Traoré, the allegations fit into a troubling pattern. Since taking power, he has survived multiple coup attempts, at least 3 by official counts, each reinforcing the sense that his leadership exists under constant threat. Every new accusation, every late-night broadcast deepens the feeling that the country is living in a permanent state of emergency. Yet the timing made this moment especially sensitive. Just days earlier, Burkina Faso had lost 3-0 to Ivory Coast at AFCON, a high-profile football match that already stirred national emotion. What had begun as a sporting rivalry now appeared, at least in the eyes of Burkina Faso authorities, to mirror a far more dangerous confrontation behind the scenes. By choosing to make these accusations public, the government crossed an invisible line. It signaled that Burkina Faso no longer saw its struggle as purely internal, but as part of a wider regional power contest, one where alliances, money, and influence could determine who survives and who falls. And as the night broadcast faded from television screens, one reality settled in for millions of viewers. This was no longer just about politics. It was about whether the state itself could endure another shock. The moment Burkina Faso's government pointed outward, the story changed. What began as an internal security alert instantly escalated into a regional confrontation when officials named Ivory Coast as the alleged source of financing behind the plot. This was no longer just about rogue actors or disloyal officers. It was about borders, neighbors, and the fragile balance of power in West Africa. For many Burkina Faso citizens watching that late-night address, the accusation landed like a shockwave. Ivory Coast is not a distant power. It is a country tied to Burkina Faso through decades of migration, trade, family links, and shared history. Millions of Burkina Faso have lived and worked there. To hear it described as the staging ground for an assassination attempt against President Ibrahim Traoré forced people to confront an unsettling possibility: the danger might be closer than anyone wanted to admit. The government's framing was careful but firm. Officials did not describe a spontaneous act of violence. They spoke of planning, coordination, and financing. In other words, this was presented as an operation with structure, something that required time, money, and political intent. The reference to a former transitional president living in exile deepened that sense of gravity. If true, it suggested that this was not simply about removing Traoré, but about reversing the entire direction Burkina Faso had taken, and that direction has been controversial. Since seizing power, Traoré has positioned himself as a leader willing to challenge long-standing regional and international arrangements. He withdrew Burkina Faso from ECOWAS, accusing it of serving external interests. He aligned his country with Mali and Niger in a new Sahel alliance. And he openly rejected what he described as Western interference while moving closer to alternative partners. To his supporters, these choices represented courage. To his critics, they represented instability. That divide helps explain why reactions to the accusations were so intense and so polarized. Inside Burkina Faso, the government's message found a receptive audience among those who already believed their country was under siege. For them, the alleged plot confirmed a long-held fear that abandoning old alliances would come at a cost, and that powerful interests, regional or otherwise, would not step aside quietly. On social media and local radio, many framed the situation as a struggle for sovereignty. The question was no longer whether Traoré was perfect, but whether Burkina Faso had the right to choose its own path without facing violent retaliation. Outside the country, however, the response was far more restrained. Ivory Coast offered no immediate public comment. That silence was interpreted in different ways. Some saw it as diplomatic caution, a refusal to escalate tensions without clear evidence. Others saw it as troubling ambiguity, arguing that silence in moments like this only fuels suspicion. Across the wider region, governments watched carefully. West Africa has lived through waves of coups, counter-coups, and military takeovers over the past decade. Each new accusation risks reopening old wounds and inspiring new instability. No leader wants to see a precedent where neighbors are openly accused of financing assassinations, especially on national television. And yet the timing made neutrality difficult. Just days earlier, Burkina Faso and Ivory Coast had faced each other at AFCON, where football rivalry stirred powerful emotions. Ivorian fans celebrated a decisive victory. Burkina Faso supporters were left disappointed. Against that backdrop, the shift from sport to security felt abrupt, even jarring. But for Burkina Faso's leadership, the message was clear: what mattered was not the score on the pitch, but survival off it. Internationally, reactions were muted but attentive. Western governments did not immediately weigh in, but analysts noted the broader implications. Another destabilization in the Sahel would not remain local. It would affect migration flows, regional security, and global geopolitical competition already playing out across Africa. As the dust settled, one thing was undeniable. Burkina Faso had entered a dangerous phase where words alone could shift alliances, provoke retaliation, or push a fragile region closer to the edge. And for President Ibrahim Traoré, the spotlight grew harsher. Whether hero or liability reformer or risk, he had become impossible to ignore. While accusations and counter-accusations dominated headlines, ordinary people in Burkina Faso were left to absorb the consequences in silence. For many families, the late-night announcement was not interpreted through the lens of geopolitics, but through fear and uncertainty. In neighborhoods already accustomed to instability, the idea that another assassination attempt had been narrowly avoided reopened wounds that never fully healed. Parents wondered whether schools would remain open. Shopkeepers questioned whether markets would be safe. Soldiers' families braced themselves for what another round of tension might demand. Burkina Faso has lived under constant pressure since President Ibrahim Traoré came to power. Multiple coup attempts, repeated security alerts, and ongoing jihadist violence have turned emergency into routine. Each new threat reinforces the sense that peace is always provisional, something that can vanish overnight. Politically, the implications were just as heavy. Traoré's leadership has always rested on a delicate balance. On one side, he is embraced by supporters across Africa as a symbol of resistance, a young leader who openly challenged foreign dominance and rejected established regional structures. On the other, critics argue that his confrontational stance has isolated Burkina Faso, increasing pressure on an already fragile state. The alleged coup plot intensified that debate. Supporters saw confirmation of what they had long believed, that Burkina Faso's independence comes at a price, and that choosing a different path would inevitably provoke retaliation. For them, the accusation against Ivory Coast fit into a broader narrative, one in which sovereignty is punished and obedience rewarded. But among skeptics, concerns deepened. They asked whether constant accusations and emergency broadcasts were creating a climate of permanent anxiety, one that could erode trust, silence dissent, and normalize exceptional measures. Even without judging the truth of the allegations, they worried about what happens to a society that lives perpetually on alert. The security situation only sharpened these fears. Large parts of the country remain affected by jihadist violence. Armed groups continue to operate in rural areas, displacing civilians and straining the army. Despite changes in alliances and strategy, the violence has not disappeared. For many citizens, this raises painful questions. Is the state gaining control or simply fighting on too many fronts at once? Politically, the accusation also risked narrowing Traoré's room for maneuver. By publicly naming a neighboring country, Burkina Faso tied its internal security narrative to regional diplomacy. Any escalation, even rhetorical, could affect trade, migration, and cross-border movement. Millions of Burkinabe have family, work, or history tied to Ivory Coast. A prolonged rift would not stay confined to political elites. It would ripple through everyday lives. At the same time, the accusation strengthened Traoré's image as a leader under siege. For some, that image commands loyalty. Leaders threatened from the outside often rally domestic support, especially when national pride is at stake. For others, it raises the risk of entrenchment, where criticism is dismissed as disloyalty and debate becomes dangerous. In the end, the most profound consequence may be psychological. When a country repeatedly hears that its president is a target, that enemies are everywhere, and that danger is constant, fear becomes political currency. It can unite, but it can also exhaust. It can inspire vigilance, but it can also breed resignation. Burkina Faso now stands at a crossroads where security, sovereignty, and civilian well-being collide. The choices made in the coming months will not only shape the fate of one leader, but the resilience of a society already stretched thin. And as history has shown across the Sahel, what begins as a political crisis rarely remains political for long. From Washington to European capitals, the accusations coming out of Burkina Faso were not ignored, but they were handled with caution. Publicly, the reaction from the United States and its allies was restrained. There were no immediate condemnations, no urgent press conferences, no dramatic statements of support or disbelief. Instead, there was silence, the kind of silence that signals watching, calculating, and waiting. For American policymakers, Burkina Faso now sits at the intersection of several uncomfortable trends. On one hand, the Sahel has become a region of deep concern for U.S. national security, rising jihadist violence, collapsing civilian governments, and growing instability that fuels displacement and migration. On the other hand, leaders like Ibrahim Traoré represent a clear departure from the post-Cold War order that Washington spent decades trying to shape. Traoré's rejection of Western military partnerships, his withdrawal from ECOWAS, and his alignment with Mali and Niger have not gone unnoticed. Nor has his government's willingness to explore closer cooperation with Russia and China. In strategic circles, Burkina Faso is increasingly viewed not just as a fragile state, but as a symbol of Africa's broader geopolitical pivot. From this perspective, the alleged assassination plot raises troubling questions. If the accusations are true, they point to a region where power struggles are no longer confined within borders, where influence, money, and pressure move quietly across lines drawn on maps. If the accusations are exaggerated or politicized, they still reveal how deeply mistrust now defines regional relationships. Either way, the Sahel looks less stable than ever. For older American audiences who remember the Cold War, the parallels are hard to miss. Africa once again appears as a chessboard where larger forces compete not always openly, but persistently. The difference today is that African leaders are increasingly refusing to play by rules written elsewhere. Beyond geopolitics, U.S. immigration policy adds another layer to this story. At the same moment Burkina Faso was warning of an external threat, Washington was expanding a policy requiring nationals from 24 African countries to post visa bonds of up to $15,000 to enter the United States for business or tourism. While framed as an immigration control measure, the message received across Africa was unmistakable. Movement is becoming more restricted, trust more conditional. For many Africans, including those in Burkina Faso, this reinforced a growing perception that independence is met not with partnership, but with distance. European governments, too, are watching carefully. Instability in the Sahel affects them directly through migration, security, and energy concerns. Yet they now face a dilemma: engage with military-led governments they once criticized, or risk losing all influence as new alliances take shape. From a global standpoint, Burkina Faso's crisis is no longer just national. It reflects a wider shift where African states are asserting sovereignty in ways that unsettle established powers. Whether through new security alliances, economic partnerships, or outright defiance of diplomatic norms, the continent is signaling that the old playbook no longer applies. For the United States and the world, the question is no longer whether Africa is changing. It is whether the world is prepared to respond not with pressure alone, but with understanding of why leaders like Ibrahim Traoré continue to find support even amid controversy and crisis. As the noise fades and the headlines move on, Burkina Faso remains standing at a dangerous crossroads. What the country has just lived through: an alleged assassination plot, accusations pointing beyond its borders, and another reminder of how fragile power can be, is not an isolated episode. It is part of a longer, more unsettling story unfolding across the Sahel and increasingly across Africa as a whole. For President Ibrahim Traoré, the message is unmistakable. Leadership in this moment comes with a price. Every decision to reject old alliances, every move toward sovereignty, every public challenge to established power structures increases both admiration and hostility. Supporters see courage. Critics see risk. But neither side can deny that the stakes are rising. The real danger lies not only in whether this alleged plot was real or exaggerated. The deeper warning is what happens when politics becomes a permanent state of emergency. When leaders govern under constant threat and citizens live with the expectation that tomorrow could bring another crisis, trust begins to erode. Fear can unite a nation, but it can also wear it down. For ordinary Burkinabe families, the questions are painfully practical. Will schools stay open? Will markets remain safe? Will young men be sent again to fight battles that never seem to end? And for the region, the implications stretch even further. If neighbors begin openly accusing one another of financing coups and assassinations, the fragile fabric holding West Africa together weakens. Trade suffers. Migration becomes politicized. Diplomacy hardens. What begins as a security issue risks becoming a cycle of suspicion that no one truly controls. From the American perspective, this moment deserves careful attention. Too often, Africa is reduced to headlines about chaos or instability stripped of context, history, and agency. But what is happening in Burkina Faso is also a story about choice, about a nation attempting to redefine its future in a global system that does not easily tolerate independence from its norms. The question for the United States and the wider world is not whether we agree with Ibrahim Traoré's methods or alliances. The question is whether we are willing to understand why leaders like him continue to resonate with millions, even amid controversy, even amid danger. Because ignoring these realities does not make them disappear, and dismissing them does not make the consequences smaller. So now the final questions belong to you. Do you believe President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform strategies can truly stabilize Burkina Faso, or are we watching the early stages of a deeper regional fracture that will shape Africa and global politics for years to come? If you feel that stories like this are too important to be buried beneath quick headlines, please share this video and subscribe. If you believe that understanding Africa requires patience, honesty, and the courage to look beyond comfort, your voice matters, and the conversation is only just beginning.